there's no way we can avoid collapse in terms of full systems collapse now. We've gone well past the lock-ins that play here such that an unraveling is going to happen no matter what we do, without, again, diminishing the devastating impacts of what that means. Understanding that also offers a liberatory approach, because now I'm not trying to save capitalism, I'm not trying to save a system. I'm instead interested in committing to planting seeds for post-capitalist futures. It's the cult of speed that has disconnected us from all that is really important in terms of our bodies, the earth around us, and the understanding of what it means to live in harmony with life. To reconnect with that, we have to go through various cycles that take time. But what we can do is we can contribute in our own ways to the systems change, planting seeds, giving people a sense of what that world beyond capitalism feels like.
Welcome back to the Better Future podcast. I'm your host, Michael Mez, and today is a special one for me because I'm talking with Donnie Maclurcan, founder of the Post-Growth Institute. Donnie has played a major role in my journey. It was actually a podcast episode with Donnie that first exposed me to the concept of post-growth. And that conversation was life-changing for me. It sent me down the path that I'm on now, and in many ways inspired my decision to focus my life's work on raising awareness for what sustainability actually means and what a better future could actually look like. In this conversation, Donnie breaks down the concept of post-growth, including a diagnosis of why capitalism always produces debt and inequality, why so many of us feel financially squeezed no matter how hard we work, and why ecological breakdown is actually baked into the system. But we also go deep into the possibility side, including what a post-capitalist circular economy would actually feel like, and what everyday people can do today to participate in a post-growth future. This conversation is expansive, it's grounding, and I hope liberating to listen to. So let's get into it. So, I'm here with Donnie Maclurcan. Donnie, it's so nice to be here with you.
Oh, Mike, what an opportunity.
I'm truly excited because you've played such a role in my personal journey towards this entire line of work and what I'm doing with my life. In many ways was sparked by listening to you speak. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to bring you and your ideas to more people.
Oh, well, it's such a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you in this particular moment.
So you founded an organization called the Post-Growth Institute. So let's just maybe start from square one. What is post-growth and why is it important?
You know, it's a great question that I've been grappling with myself as well for the past 15 years. And what I found over that time is the easiest way to answer that question is to describe what post-growth actually feels like. For about 13 of those 15 years, I've conducted an experiment around the world, which invites people to get a pen and paper and essentially explore what a future that's working for everyone and everything, human and non-human species, feels like, what an economy that's working for everyone and everything feels like. And so people then draw some kind of symbology for that, and then they do the same for the present. And what's fascinating is that across cultures, across difference, having run this experiment with more than 10,000 people now, from Fortune 500 executives to people who are living on the streets in languages other than English, etc., is that consistently people draw one of 5 symbols or shapes for the future and one of 5 symbols or shapes for the present, or a close variation or combination. And what they draw for the future, which is a circle, a spiral, an infinity symbol, a nodule, a blob, or a heart, and then for the present, a jagged line, an isosceles triangle, a downward arrow, a rectangle, or a mess of lines. What we see there is that everybody knows in their body that a future that works, an economy that's working for everyone and everything, has to have non-linearity built into it. It has to have some kind of circularity, just as nature does in terms of the way its systems operate. And everybody knows as well that the present has linearity baked into it. So post-growth is moving from the left-hand side, the present, to the right-hand side of what people draw, from a linear system where things need to have a dependency to grow, whether that's the economy, whether that's production, consumption, or, as we might explore today, money and debt stocks in the world, these things that are required to grow for the system to be maintained, versus the future we know that we need, which is post that dependency in terms of growth, where things circulate naturally inherently, just like carbon and nitrogen cycle through our ecology, there's aspects of things that are needed in an economy that can work to circulate naturally as part of the operating system itself.
When you describe that, I can feel myself relaxing almost. It's like, it sounds so nice to have an economy that works the way the natural world does. But that's quite the opposite of what we have now.
Well, it's the opposite in some ways, although there are parts of our economy that do have that circulation built in, which is why I suspect it feels so nice, because there's a resonance on some level. We know what it's like, for example, for families to look out for each other. We know what it's like to look out for our neighbors and our loved ones in ways that don't involve monetary exchange and these sorts of things. We know what it's like to give and receive love and to care for each other in the informal economy. And that's a very familiar thing. And it's actually a bedrock of a lot of people's experiences through childhood, etc.
Yeah.
So we know what that feels like. And we also know what it feels like to connect with the wider natural world, the calming effect and that effect that it has, connecting into something that is so cyclical, something that understands growth cycles and decay cycles as a part of life, is a beautiful reminder to us of what does exist. But as you say, the overarching market economy that we find ourselves in globally is heading in an opposite direction. And that's where that dissonance exists.
What is it about the modern capitalist growth-based economy that is antithetical to post-growth and sort of more circularity? Why is capitalism incompatible with post-growth and with the natural world?
I'll start with the definition of capitalism,
Okay.
which for me is primarily a for-profit market system in which the fundamental principle is the accumulation of money and wealth into the hands of private individuals. Right there, if you take that definition and you accepted that definition, we have a dilemma, because any system that accumulates and has accumulation as its fundamental principle is going to hit up against limits. Why? Because we live in a finite world. We live in a finite planet. Just as societies before ours have collapsed when there was excessive accumulation, whether that was cutting down trees, whether that was expanding in terms of empire, etc. Whenever you have any kind of accumulation, like in nature right now, where we see the accumulation of carbon or nitrogen, and we have these challenges associated with climate change, just as if blood or oxygen accumulated in one part of your body to the absence of it elsewhere, we would have problems. Mm-hmm. In capitalist systems, what happens is, in particular, that money accumulates in bank accounts of the wealthiest individuals, households, and corporations. When money accumulates in our system, because of the way that money enters our economy that we might want to unpack, debt has to accumulate elsewhere. And so what happens in any type of capitalism, whether it's a more regulated form of capitalism or a more free market form of capitalism, we have inequity baked into the system where money is accumulating with the wealthiest and debt is accumulating elsewhere. It explains so much of the challenges with affordability. The idea of cost of living exists because of the levels of inequity that are baked into the system that get hidden because we might point to periods in history where places were able to reduce inequality, etc. But in the aggregate, when we look at colonial forces, neo-colonial forces, and what's happening around the world, and mathematically, in any form of capitalism, you will always see overall a rising inequality, and that inequality actually underpins ecological crisis for a lot of reasons, both in terms of status envy, in the way that people's choices are limited often to what they need to do to survive, but more so because capitalism enables a very select few people to control the narrative about what a good life is. And at the moment, the self-serving narrative that underpins capitalism is you're not good enough, you don't have enough, and there's not enough for everyone. And so those three things, you're not enough, you don't have enough, and there's not enough for everyone, is a narrative that perpetuates throughout this system. It serves the wealthiest to maintain that narrative so they can sell more things, etc. And it absolutely runs up against ecological limits.
There's so much to unpack there, but let's maybe start with one of the first things you mentioned around the monetary system and debt.
Yeah.
So the way I understand it is that you're saying if there's accumulation of money and or capital in the system to specific nodes, whether that's an individual, a billionaire, or a very rich corporation, then that will necessarily prevent the circulation and circularity that is needed in the economy. And part of that has to do with the way that we make money. So in what ways is the monetary system design part of the problem?
It's a great question because, as we might come to later, it's both part of the problem and a gateway for a way out of this. So we'll come back to that. So it might be of interest for people to know something that I didn't know 15 years ago, which was who creates money and how. I guess I had always thought that it was governments or treasuries, but in reality, money is created universally, whether I'm in Afghanistan, Fiji, or here in the US. Money is created the same way by banks, whether those are commercial banks or central banks. They are the only entity that has the capacity to create money in terms of what we call the money supply. Not the actual printing of the bills or the coins, etc. That's a very, very small part of when we're talking about money, right? Most of the world's money, only 3% or so is actually coins and notes. Most of it is numbers in accounts digitally. How does it happen, that money creation? Well, it happens when loans are created. It's not what people think that you have money in a bank account somewhere and then the bank goes and uses that money, etc. No, that doesn't exist. It's interesting. I typed into Google just a few days ago, how's money created? Because I'm always interested to see what the AI is generating. And it gave that idea, which is incorrect, that money is taken from an existing account and passed on as the bank as an intermediary. And it's not true. So what happens then? Let's say that, Mike, you wanted to get a car loan for a used car. And let's say it's going to cost $15,000. And imagine that before this hypothetical experience, there was, for sake of this experiment, $1 million in the global money supply in terms of in bank accounts and coins and things like that. And there was also, let's say, $1 million of debt. So now you take out a loan of $15,000. They put the money in your account, or maybe they send it directly to whomever you're buying the vehicle from. And now there is $1,015,000 in the money supply. But of course, you hold a debt for the equivalent amount. So there's now $1 million.
I'm in debt to the bank.
You're in debt to the bank. So there's now $1,015,000 of debt as well.
So like money creation necessitates debt creation.
Let's go even one step further.
Yeah.
That means that if you have any money in your pocket right now or in a bank account somewhere, there has to be an equivalent debt somewhere in the world. Not only that, there are ways that debt gets added to our system without new money getting created. And you'd be familiar with this. The first part is, for example, is interest on top of that debt, right? You're going to have to pay back more debt to the bank, but the interest on top of that debt that you owe didn't involve any new money getting created. There's also one more way, and it's a little technical, but for example, when the US government or any government around the world wants to raise money, the primary way that they do that is they sell bonds. And so you or I could buy, if we were interested and we had the funds, we could buy what might be called the US Treasury. So if I buy a US Treasury for $1, the government now owes $1 of debt. It has $1 of debt, so it owes me $1 at whatever the expiry date is of the coupon associated with that bond. But no new money is being created because I used existing money. This explains why we have roughly $324 trillion of debt in our global economy and about $130 trillion in the global money supply. Much more debt than money because there are ways of creating debt without creating new money. This piece of information of understanding that in a capitalist system where money accumulates, and it's the fundamental aspect, money will always accumulate faster than it circulates. The money siphon is stronger than the money pump, and we can unpack that in a moment if helpful. because money keeps accumulating in our capitalist system, debt has to accumulate elsewhere, and now we have the grounds for expanding inequality, exploitation, etc., that is the bedrock under which our ecological challenges, our climate change challenges sits, because of this underlying dynamic that is inherent to any form of capitalism.
And what is it about capitalism that necessitates money accumulation?
Yeah. If we go back to this principle of why, what is your purpose for engaging in business in a capitalist system if you're thinking like a capitalist?
Yeah.
It is to gain a greater return on any investment, whether that's an investment of labor, an investment of your own money in a primary activity that is your own business, or if you're so-called investing in the stock market, etc. You're seeking a return that's greater than inflation. You're seeking a return that is as big as possible often.
The profit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important that we maybe name that it's profit maximizing, because profit, as we'll see later on, is not a problematic thing if it circulates. It's profit maximizing. It's when you're seeking to get the most out of something in that particular way. And this comes back to when you asked, what's post-growth?
Yeah.
Post-growth is delinking from that obsession for it to always be bigger and as big as it can be. And so what happens is in capitalism, over time, money accumulates through particularly capital gains, interest, dividends of various kinds if people own stocks, rents on land. So, the amount of income that you get from renting out land and property, these sorts of things. It's maintained by things like inheritance. And so imagining that money is accumulating with individuals and businesses, and then it gets circulated to an extent. How? Not so much through reinvestment, because you're reinvesting to make more money. So overall, that continues this cycle of accumulation. But you have taxation, wages if you're an employer,
right, paying your employees.
Right? Yeah. Various subsidies, insurance, these sorts of things. But imagine if the amount of circulation back into the real economy, where everyone's doing the bulk of the work, was 100%. Imagine if you had a profit of $1 million a year, and then through philanthropy, taxation, etc., all of it went back. It wouldn't be capitalism, right? Like, what's the point? And that's the challenge, is that in capitalism, the whole point is to accumulate. But what most people, including most capitalist business leaders that I've talked to, don't realize is that the accumulation itself actually leads to an accumulation of debt elsewhere. Because most capitalists, especially entrepreneurial capitalists, think about things in terms of what we might describe as a non-zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? They say, look, innovation, value creation is limitless. And they're right. If you and I start a business together and we wanted to, for example, create a home or build some product, etc., there's no limit to what we might be able to produce. Of course, there's an extractive limit, but fundamentally, or if it's an idea or some kind of social innovation, there's no limit. But what underpins business activity in capitalist economics has limits because of this money and debt phenomenon. Because if I keep accumulating somewhere else, whether that's a government or a household or a corporation, a small business or a big business that's maybe a zombie business that's got massive amounts of debt on its books or hidden, etc., these things are baked into the DNA of capitalism and often not understood even by the most intelligent capitalists that exist.
So you've explained how money accumulates in capitalism and how that necessarily means that debt is accumulating.
Right.
Why is that a bad thing? Why does that mean that that necessarily leads to exploitation of people or the natural world?
Your listeners will know this very well in terms of a lived experience. When you are indebted, the experience is quite different, especially depending on the kind of debt you're in and the situation you're in. If you're indebted in this world and you don't have the capacity to bring in enough income to service your debts, which mathematically is baked into capitalism, some people, some governments are not going to have enough money circulating, right? Because it's accumulating. Mm-hmm. It's why we have downward pressure on wages around the world, is we have a lot of labor and not enough money circulating back. If you're in this experience and you're trying to survive, what do? Well, as we've seen throughout the last 40 years, We see people work more. We see families, let's say, where there might be 2 or 3 person household families or 2 adults in the family. Both of them go into the workforce. We see the struggles associated with debt burden go all the way through to the horrific situations of mass suicides in India, for example. But the primary way that people navigate this burden, and it's a burden that, again, feels like there's no way out because in aggregate there is no way out. The primary way that individuals and governments navigate this is to take on more debt. This is the pyramid scheme. This is the kicking the bucket further down the path, right? Is that you're drowning in debt. You're trying, let's say, some of your listeners might be trying to afford a home if they've managed to get out of a rental situation, let's say. And you're doing everything you can to afford that home, but the asset prices are going up. So the later you get into that game globally, because asset prices across different classes are going to keep rising as money keeps accumulating, because you've got more money and it's outpacing, the accumulation of that money is outpacing the productive value of the things that you can invest in. It's why we've got derivatives and NFTs and all of these places to try to create an avenue for putting money that keeps accumulating. But a lot of that gets poured into houses. So house prices keep going up. You've got downward pressure on wages, which means less and less people can get a foot into something like housing for themselves. And so this is a real lived experience of a lot of people waking up on the wrong side of capitalism, right? The waking up with an indebted position. And in fact, if you wake up today and your net position is that you have assets that are greater than your debts, then you're somewhat unique in the world. Throughout the global south, throughout marginalized communities in the global north and elsewhere, and especially along racialized lines and gendered lines, people are living with the yoke of debt on their shoulders every single day. And it affects the ability to make decisions. It affects your choices in life. It affects your freedoms. And the story, psychologically, the story that is so often told, especially in countries like the US, is pull yourself up, just work harder, be more productive, go study, etc., etc., etc. And mathematically, that is not an answer to the challenges that are faced.
I think a lot of people will resonate with that because it's a macroeconomic explanation for something that we're all feeling on an individual level. How does this affect the natural world? Because a lot of the ways that I have come to understand post-growth are partly about fixing human suffering and the yoke that we're all carrying in this debt-based, growth-based economy. And I know that part of it also is about a solution to what is becoming a very pressing climate crisis. So how does this interface with the environment?
There are so many ways that the connection between post-growth economics and the natural world interface. And to understand that, we have to go back to what the growth system does in terms of our interface with the natural world. My experience around the world has been that this system of capitalism in its various forms, to lesser and greater extents, pushes people in a cult of speed, in a cult of never enough, to largely be in constant states of stress and dysregulation. And from that space, where so much of our thoughts are running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, or you're just on survival mode, you're in flight, fight, freeze, and fawn, you're trying to get the kids to school, you're trying to get to work, you're dealing with a sick family member, an aging parent, all of these pieces, the mortgage is there, you're just trying to survive. It's actually quite hard then to stay connected to nature and our bodies being the most present form of the natural world, remembering that we are majority water. And that might sound a little abstract, but what I mean here is that we had people throughout the last 40, 50 years campaigning so heavily on climate-related things. But at the end of the day, if you're under immense stress, financially and otherwise, how are you going to be able to make decisions that might align with nature? It's a very privileged thing, all right? It's a privileged thing to even have the time to go march for aspects of the climate. And it's privileged these days to even be able to be in nature as we understand it more broadly, even though we are of nature.
Even having access to it.
Right, having access to it, having the time to even stop. I know so many people around the world who work 7 days a week, which means they work 365 days a year.
And if they take time off, it's probably to go to the DMV or go to the doctor. It's not to survive.
Exactly. And so the connection, this take, make, waste system, this linear system, that it would be part, just to be clear, any kind of system is going to have linearity in it, no matter if it's a post-growth system or not. We're always going to be extracting, we're always going to be making, and we're going to be wasting. The idea is to be slowing that process down and for it to not be in aggregate so large that the ability for the earth to ameliorate, to actually absorb the wastes and to deal with the externalities, as they're called, the things that get created in this process that we're not factoring in. The idea is for that to all fit within the ability of the earth to support us as she does, Mother Earth does, right? So beautifully. And we've gone beyond that limit. Around 1982, the year I was born, we moved beyond the carrying capacity of the earth in terms of how much we were taking, making, and wasting, and the ability for the earth to absorb. So we're an overshoot, as William Rees and so many others have explained. That experience of not being able to fit within ecological limits is so abstract for the average person in terms of what does that mean? How would I change it? Because you're part of a system where the DNA is to accelerate that process. And you might, in your heart, when you have a moment to be in it, know something's wrong just because, as per that drawing experiment, we know this isn't right.
Yeah.
But the agency you have to actually engage with that can feel very, very limited. And even your connection with what that world would look like and what it means to actually thrive within nature is difficult. You might have the luxury of getting away for a weekend in a forest somewhere and have this fleeting remembering of what that slower pace looks like. And then it's back to things come Monday, for example.
And what you're describing on the individual level maps so well to the way I understand the inability of the global capitalist economy to really solve climate change, because the externalities and extraction and environmental harm are built into the very nature of what this system is. The idea that we can just produce more products, we can't produce our way out of the environmental crisis. We can't consume our way out of the environmental crisis. We actually need to consume less stuff.
Yes.
But you can't consume less in capitalism. The whole thing is based on us consuming more every year so that profits can continue to accumulate, the GDP can continue to go up. And
well, now someone would say, well, actually, you can produce things that have less environmental impact. You can innovate through various forms of efficiency your way out of this. And that's where a lot of environmentalists, in my experience, go down a path that presents an avenue that is not a strong argument, because they'll say, no, we live on a finite planet. There are ecological limits. And so again, you hit this zero-sum versus non-zero-sum piece. What do I mean by that? You've got the innovators saying, look, we can innovate our way out of this because there's no limit to productivity gains, to efficiency gains, to decarbonization gains. And then you've got ecologists and environmentalists of various kinds saying, but the earth is a finite resource. We have to work within that resource. The piece that brings these all together is the piece we touched on before. In any form of capitalism, you're going to see debt in aggregate expand and therein inequality expand. And when you have expanding inequality and you have a system that has self-serving behaviors by the people who are benefiting the most, that's the bit where the idea of innovating our way out of this hits up against limits. Because if I am gaining from this system and my operating logic is to make as much money as I can, then I'm not going to be so interested in the innovation. And even if I was interested in the innovation, let's say that through AI and through various forms of investment, and let's say even all the way through to forms of public financing that are different, modern monetary theory, etc. Let's say that we saw massive investment in forms of efficiency tomorrow on a level we've never seen before. You still wouldn't get out of this dilemma because inequality would be growing because it's still capitalism.
And maybe it would be good to double click on that, because why does inequality necessarily grow? We talked about how debt grows, but why does that mean inequality grows?
Yeah, and so while people might be gaining certain assets around the world in terms of things being created, whether that's an item that you have or a home, etc., what's happening is that money is accumulating, which means asset prices are going up on the one hand, and debt is accumulating elsewhere, which means we've got downward pressure on wages. And so in that circumstance, the relative experience of each of those becomes wider. The Gini coefficient in the aggregate gets wider.
That's a measure of inequality.
Exactly, a measure of inequality. And I mentioned this earlier, that something that gets hidden in this process is, look at the post-war period in Europe and the US, for example. Yeah, look at the post-war period when you look at the data globally. Those were periods of extreme extraction of money and wealth through labor and exploitation from global south to global north that continues today, as people like Jason Hickel and others and Vandana Shiva point to in these extractive appropriative processes. And in fact, so much of the data on money and debt didn't include many global south countries until recently. And so there was all this hidden extraction.
Yeah, because people do point to the New Deal era in the US as taxes on the rich were higher. There was more investment into not only the social safety net, but also infrastructure and actual public wealth, public infrastructure projects. And so I think a lot of people, especially folks who are progressive on the economic front, but maybe not anti-capitalist, who are sort of, into social democracy.
Regulated markets,
they would point to that era and say, that's when things were working. And you're saying that things weren't actually working then?
No. In fact, there's a way I describe this across the political spectrum. If you have more free market forms versus more regulated forms within capitalist systems, what happens is that the free market approaches accelerate the wealth siphon, the monetary siphon. They accelerate this inequality creating process. The more regulated forms slow it down, but they hide it better. So wealth inequality might have been growing at a slower rate. Just like if you look at the Nordic countries now, for example, often pointed to as success stories. But if you look at the inequality data, inequality keeps growing there. It's just hidden because it's hard for us to imagine systems outside of capitalism. And so the reference point is state versus market, more free market versus more regulated form of capitalism. In both of those ends of the spectrum, we have the same dilemma. And in fact, I would argue that the more hidden forms of this dilemma are actually the more pernicious because they cut off the imagination for what a market system beyond capitalism might look and feel like.
This is a great time to start talking about what we could do instead of capitalism.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin? I mean, you've spoken, I suppose the entire point of the Post-Growth Institute is to help move the world towards a economic system beyond capitalism. I think, there's the common phrase, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I'm sure you disagree because you spend a lot of your time imagining the end of capitalism. But how do we even begin to paint a picture for folks as to what a world beyond capitalism would look like?
There's a beautiful body of work that I was introduced to 25 years ago called Asset-Based Community Development, ABCD. It intersects with another body of more intellectual work called Appreciative Inquiry. And essentially in both of those methodologies, you seek to look at what already works and what already exists that's good in any situation, in this case, in a system. When I begin by looking at what's already working in terms of these fundamental principles of the circulation of money and power, which are the lifeblood of our society, especially our economic system, you discover that there's actually a lot already that operates that way in spite of capitalism. Let's take an example close to home here in the US. And I'm going to ask you a question, Mike. I'll put you on the spot a little bit here. You have about 260 million adults in the US that bank on an annual basis out of the overall population. What number of people in the US do you think have a bank account with a not-for-profit bank, a bank that has no private individual equity owners? What number of people do you think in this country, the belly of the beast here in the US? What number?
I know a lot of people use credit unions, so got to be in the tens of millions, maybe 30 million.
30 million. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot, yeah.
It's 144 million people
Whoa.
have a bank account with a credit union, which, as you said, are not-for-profit banks. There's no private individual. No one owns a credit union. It's the depositor's money that creates the initial capital, and all of the profits go back into serving the members by reducing the costs of loans and increasing the rates on deposit, as well as philanthropy and other things that credit unions do. And that's not even to add the many not-for-profit forms of banks that exist in addition to credit unions, like the Bank of North Dakota, which is the US's only national public bank on a state level. Or here we have Beneficial State Bank, for example. That's a foundation-owned bank. In fact, 40% of the world's banks are public banks. A huge amount that Ellen Brown has highlighted in her work on this topic. And so inside this system, even though it's only 12% of the overall equity, right, the overall amount of money that's in banks in the US, it's still a majority of people who bank in the US have an account with a not-for-profit bank. Now, many of them might not know that it's a not-for-profit bank. Many of them might not think of it in that way. Many of them, I'm sure, would not say this is a post-capitalist form of banking. But if we go back to the definition of capitalism, monetary accumulation, etc., as a fundamental principle, this is a business model that's operating outside of that driver, and it's doing it very successfully. The rates that you get at a credit union are very competitive and often outcompete the for-profit equivalent banks, which is why people bank with them so often, let alone the customer service, etc.
So, not-for-profit businesses existing in capitalism now can shine a light towards what future business models could transition towards. Are you saying that we need more businesses that are not for profit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say something even more than that, which is, from our research, almost 20% of global GDP comes from forms of business that are not for profit. And there are 4 types. There are foundation-owned businesses. There are government enterprises. There are consumer cooperatives and non-profits that went into business and have business models underneath of them. And for each of these, we have significant examples that people would be familiar with in ways that they might not have ever considered that business to be not-for-profit. Now, the challenge is that many of the businesses that we might explore in just a minute that fit this model, that circulate their profits back into the system and address the fundamental extraction underneath capitalism, where the money keeps getting siphoned and therefore the debt has to be elsewhere and the inequality grows. Many of those businesses are still operating in a capitalist system, and so they have an appearance that often is deceptive. You might say, oh, that's just another part of the capitalist system.
Yeah.
But it's what happens with the money and the profits that changes the growth dynamic that sits underneath all of our challenges.
Because it prevents money from accumulating in the way that capitalists.
Exactly.
So what are these? I feel like this is cool because it's like a mystery that people don't necessarily know that there's all these not-for-profit businesses operating. Like, are there any examples that are your favorites to maybe highlight for us?
Yeah, I'll give some examples across the global north for starters. So Bosch, the engineering company, maybe if you've seen a dishwasher that's from Bosch or a service center for a vehicle, Bosch is a foundation-owned business. I was just with someone last week running a workshop, and I saw some Playmobil products in the corner, right? This is the Lego-ish like childhood toys that actually emerged during the oil crisis, and therefore this innovator in this family business that had been around for 100+ years decided to create hollow figurines and toys that are now globally famous. Playmobil is a foundation-owned business for the last 9 years, I believe. Fully owned by a foundation where all the profits go back into early childhood education. Patagonia, right, is another example that people may be familiar with, where the sole owner put all of the money over into a perpetual trust so that now all of the profits go back towards climate change initiatives. Some of the other ones I might mention might be a little more surprising and maybe raise some questions in terms of the link to sustainability. But again, the critical thing is what happens with the macroeconomics. Downstream is what happens in terms of production, consumption. Those decisions get made because of the accumulation of money and power in our system. So, for example, the Green Bay Packers are a consumer cooperative. All mutual insurance companies around the world, about 27% of insurance is not for profit. It's mutual. So Nationwide, State Farm, for example. The Real Madrid, Barcelona Football Club.
Cool.
You can be a member of those organizations, vote every year, be on the board. They are not for profit. Even though there's high salaries for, as per the market in terms of football, the profits from those companies go straight back into the system. And then one of the biggest examples that I share that, again, is hard. There's challenges that people have with this example, but IKEA.
Oh, the furniture company.
IKEA is not for profit. Has been since 1982.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
All the profits circulate back, goes to climate change, gender empowerment work, etc. Because back in the 80s, the owner, Ingvar Kamprad, because he was interested in ensuring that his business wasn't exposed to a hostile takeover, and for tax purposes, put all of the business over into a foundation-owned structure. What's so hard for people to know about these examples in terms of them painting a different path for the world is that the frame of reference for so many people, for journalists, etc. I mean, there's so many stories about in Australia, the country where I come from, why IKEA is not paying any taxes. Yeah, you know why it doesn't pay any taxes? Because it's not for profit. This is a benefit that entities get around the world when they don't have any private individual equity ownership, is we say, great, you have a purpose that you are centering. We're not going to tax you in terms of corporate taxes. For so many years, Ingvar Kamprad's lawyer would write to the Forbes rich list, who kept putting him on the list, saying he's one of the richest men in the world. And his lawyer would say he doesn't own any of the business. And sure enough, when he died, what happened with the inheritance? With his kids? There was no inheritance. He didn't own IKEA. So we walk through this world where we see what appears to us, I think, as businesses, right? Business, government, civil society, these three sort of areas. And the reality is that those things are way more convoluted. There's so much civil society that actually operates with business models, whether it's the YMCA or the YHA, the Youth Hostels Associations around the world, that are not-for-profit businesses that you might see as a charity or a non-profit, and in reality, most YHAs or YMCAs get a very, very small percentage of their income from donations. This is the story around the world, is that the market is actually way more complex in terms of the models that are used when it comes to ownership. But we're only trained and taught that business is a for-profit thing. And actually, in reality, if we come back to a very grounded approach to this, the majority of businesses around the world are small businesses, and very small businesses, sole proprietors. You and I, maybe, the kinds of business that we engage in privately as individuals, mum and pop stores, this kind of thing. What's shown again and again is that those kinds of businesses are not obsessed with growth. They understand trade-offs. They're often just trying to get by, offer some kind of service to a community, make enough to survive, and then have a trade-off, if possible, of some well-being, time with family, time with friends, time in nature, etc. Not trying to become the next unicorn, right? But we have a skewed sense of what business is because what we see is that big corporate expansionist, often, the billboard kind of business is put in our face. And so that reckoning with the actual realities of the world and that there are models where circulation is built in and that they can be successful companies shows us how a market economy, right, not some kind of regulated state socialism, but a market economy could actually be post-capitalist.
Before we move into other examples, I want to double click on something you said about like Patagonia and the foundation-owned model. A lot of people I know, especially on the political left, have been skeptical of this sort of thing, right? Because they're like, this is just a tax evasion scheme. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that ultimately, as long as the money is not accumulating into the bank accounts of a private owner, that's okay. You're not too worried about the amount of taxes the CEO of Patagonia or the founder of Patagonia is paying, because ultimately what matters is that the money that Patagonia makes is recirculated back into the economy, and that the foundation is basically a philanthropy organization that funds other stuff. So it's not pooling the money. Is that right?
Yeah. And in fact, to take that one step further, imagine this idea of tax avoidance, etc. So let's go back to the previous form of Patagonia. So Yvonne, the owner, the sole owner, is paying some taxes on income as well as profits, right? But not 100% taxes. So there's money accumulating for Yvonne. Now, Yvonne can be philanthropic, etc., but it's not required. It's not built into, it's not inherent, right? That's a form of redistribution rather than predistribution. In the current shift for Patagonia, all of that money goes into the profit, goes into the foundation, and the foundation has a very specific purpose, right? Which is to advance climate-related initiatives. In fact, I think they talk about the earth being the shareholder of that foundation. What that means, in addition to ensuring that money isn't just holed up, even though that foundation might have investments, etc., that mean that not all of that money is circulating immediately, its goal, if profits keep coming through, is going to align with, like its mission is going to align with the disbursement of more of that money than would have happened previously in terms of taxation, right? I'm going to make the case that the amount of disbursement is going to be much higher than the amount of taxes that would have come under the previous ownership structure in terms of circulation. And we know that the foundation's mission in this case is going to be a more direct inputting of money into circulation than taxation that goes to a government that might have various agendas, etc. But more than all of this, Mike, is that money circulating allows debts to be paid off. That's the critical piece that you're not going to hear. I'll be honest, I don't hear that conversation happening in climate change or progressive left conversations, right? Like, no one's talking about what taxation does in terms of that. They're saying tax dollars can allow for investment in public services, public goods. The critical piece in all of this is we need more money circulating so people can get out of debt. Until people are out of debt, you're not going to be able to address the relative inequality that creates. And from a space of relative inequality, our power to actually advocate for what our bodies know we need is significantly reduced. If I'm indebted and just head down trying to survive and dysregulated, I'm going to be susceptible to all sorts of coercive narratives. And we see this throughout the world with the rise of populism. The primary reason that we are not able to get out of this mess is capitalism. And the secondary reason we're not able to get out of this mess is because from dysregulated states, two things happen. Right-wing and conservative approaches to our dilemmas thrive on that dysregulation in terms of pushing a particular narrative that we know doesn't fundamentally fit within ecological limits. But what we get in terms of progressive narratives also often come from dysregulated intellectual states and focus on redistribution. Now, I'm a fan of various forms of redistribution and love progressive taxation in terms of what it offers and an understanding of how we collectively support each other. But when your primary efforts are, for example, debt forgiveness or Green New Deals that seek to change the way we invest in terms of public goods, particularly renewables, or if you're looking at big wealth taxes, big carbon taxes, etc., and you're not simultaneously looking at the fundamental accumulation built into capitalism, then you're going to be just slowing down and hiding this process. And so from that dysregulated state, we all suffer. And that's why when we go into this experiment at the beginning of drawing what does a future feel like, and we take a moment, we tap into a deeper wisdom that understands how living systems thrive and how they die with excessive accumulation or linear accumulation. And so from that space, there's an opportunity to look at what around me already models that. How can I build on that? How can I strengthen that? And here's the beautiful thing. If I was just here sharing these ideas with some kind of idealism about the future, I probably would have given up a long time ago. The beauty of the market is that through competitive forces, and this is something that often people who are talking about post-capitalism are like, competition, no, we need collaboration. Well, let me give a little nuance on that. There's a difference between competition occurring within a collaborative ecosystem versus collaboration occurring within a competitive ecosystem. Right now, our overall system is competitive, and there's forms of collaboration that exist in good ways and unhealthy ways too. But the future that we need is a system where collaboration is the default, and then competition occurring within collaboration delivers a totally different outcome. And the claim that I'm making is that not-for-profit forms of business and others that are closely adjacent, like worker cooperatives, for example, employee-owned businesses, are increasingly out-competing for-profit equivalents. And that is how capitalism, through its own self, creates its own endpoint and a transition to post-capitalism, where it's still a market economy. It's still the kinds of things that you and I understand in terms of money, debt, interest, limited liability, corporate personhood. All of these things that are often critiqued actually flip when money circulate and become really powerful ways to actually structure market interactions, but with a different operating logic that serves life.
This is some controversial stuff, Donnie. This is some controversial stuff. One of the ways, clearly, that people can participate in post-capitalism is by working at a not-for-profit company or, moving more economic activity towards not-for-profits, finding the not-for-profits in your area,
right,
moving your money into a credit union as opposed to a for-profit bank, all of those things. And even rethinking the way they think about their own business if they have one.
Right.
What else can people do to participate in post-capitalism? You've talked a lot about regulating our nervous states.
Yes.
And I get the sense that you have a relatively regulated nervous system. You seem like a calm guy. I was like chugging coffee before the interview. You were like, I don't do that stuff. So I feel like maybe there's something you have to share about moving beyond business models into ways of living, into systems of knowledge that we can tap into that can also point the way towards post-capitalism.
Well, there are so many people who can be more articulate on this topic than myself, and I point to people like Adrienne Marie Brown and authors who and activists and artists and others who have really been embracing for such a long time a more embodied form of activism. And what I would say on that front is that my own practices of trying to, rather than be I'll set the timer and have a 5-minute, meditation or a daily practice, I seek to just bring in a couple of seconds of stopping and dropping, being in my body as much as possible. I would describe myself, and in fact, I would describe most young people in this world as systems feelers, that we're actually sensing when things are off, when we're in our bodies at a young age, and then that gets beaten out of us in terms of the intellectualization that can then happen if you're in formal education institutions, etc. And for a lot of people, there is, I think, a yearning to return to the body and what the body knows. So when I'm exploring economic theories, I'm feeling like, does this make sense? Does this add up with what my body's telling me? And that might be a little out there for some of the people listening. But so often, there's examples of how our body can tell us how to navigate if we've got the spaciousness and the tools to be able to be in our bodies. I'm going to put in an example that's a little out there. This to me is a practical example of people going to the bodies going, something isn't right here. So the Welsh water system got privatized in the 1990s. There was a US company that was owning and operating a system and doing a very poor job from all accounts in terms of extracting money.
Wait, there's a U.S. company that owned the water system in Wales?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Which is
off.
Which is exactly
Yeah.
right, but all too common a story around the world of foreign national companies owning what would typically be public goods.
Yeah.
And so a group of people, I believe 3 people, got together at a pub one night, as far as I understand the story, and said, like, this just doesn't feel right. What can we do about this? And what they did was they floated a bond on the European green bond market, and they raised, I think it was the equivalent of about $5 billion US, and they bought back the Welsh water system and created Glascymru, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is essentially a consumer cooperative, a not-for-profit business that is now well and truly on its way to paying down and off those bonds, has improved the service provision, and has been giving rebates to members as part of their cooperative in terms of their utility bill. That's an example of people saying, this doesn't feel right. What can we do about it, and getting creative? And this is going to be the bit that I'm trying to add here. The creativity about how to engage that comes from the embodied space of taking the time to explore things. Why? Because when you get into a state of heightened dysregulation, you're in back in flight, fight, freeze, and fawn, that is not a creative space. And yet that's the majority of ways that people, in my experience around the world, are showing up to work. Dysregulated, susceptible to an individual team leader or a CEO or an owner making decisions, and you just essentially operationalizing them. Whether it's through faux democracy, let's hear everyone's perspective, and in reality, no one gives a shit about what everyone's got to say. It's just, did it work? Did it make money? Did it not? If it did, let's do more of it. If it didn't, let's do less of it. My point in all of this, so much creativity in how to engage with ways of being and doing in this world differently is getting lost because we're not taking the time to be able to be in our creative neocortex. We're just responding to the urgency, the important urgent shit to survive. And I've seen again and again when groups, when individuals, when organizations have the space and the support and the structure to slow down and to feel their way through the world, they come up with some of the most incredible things that give us that future vision where, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, only because we haven't had a lot of space and time to actually imagine. And as someone who has, I can tell you, it's beautiful.
I've heard you speak before about the ways that indigenous wisdom can help point the way here. Can you share a bit about how indigenous wisdom and indigenous culture is influential in the way you perceive what a post-capitalist future could look like?
Yeah, and I've had the privilege of spending considerable time in Australia, growing up on Camaragal lands with many teachers and people who'd been themselves introduced to indigenous ways of being, which essentially are land-based, connected to land, to Mother Earth, slower, more embodied. And throughout and across cultures, you have that commitment to seeking to be in right relations with oneself, with each other, and with the land that you're inhabiting and the ecosystems that you're part of. In fact, the turning point in my journey with all of this post-capitalist work was at a 2009 conference in Brisbane on Meanjin lands, where the keynote speaker at a community development conference was a man named Colin Saltmere. He's the head of an engineering company called Mayuma that had 50 staff and about a $13 million turnover. They do civil and construction engineering. And then he said the words that changed my life. He said, and we're not for profit. Now, I had never, ever thought about an engineering company being not for profit. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, what do you mean you're not for profit? He said, well, as an Indigenous man, us mob got together seeing a need for this kind of engineering work. And we just put our own money in to start, create the founding capital. We loaned money into this entity. And the idea that we would extract from this through private ownership was not even a concept in our Indigenous ways of being, right? The idea of circulating is inherent because if you're tuned into Mother Earth, you don't see those forms of extraction to the absence of benefit for other species, etc. It's not a normal pattern in the overall operating system. So these ways of being and knowing that I saw in an actual company, right, an actual practice of indigenous wisdom really, really inspired me and dovetailed with this slowing down in my own hyper-focused, money-obsessed teenage years where I was investing in the stock market from a young age, excited about compounding interest. A returning to the slower, more curious ways of what is in our bodies being part of nature, that there is to be shared, which very much sits, I think, at the heart of all indigenous cultures, especially those that have been able, amidst genocidal forces and otherwise, to maintain a connection to themselves, each other, and the lands that they're on.
So it's the lack of extraction inherent to the culture, and probably also the incentives for recirculation of wealth that are kind of baked into how indigenous people have been living for before capitalism.
Absolutely. Think of the potlatch in the Pacific Northwest, right? In the native communities of what's now known as Canada. So the potlatch, the idea that at a certain level of wealth accumulation or at a certain moment, the wealthiest in town will put on a feast and will gift whatever it is they've accumulated and then be recognized for that generosity, which is a common thing across, for example, Polynesian cultures throughout the world, where the more you give, the more you're recognized. That understanding of the importance of circulation as a central theme for survival of a human species within a wider ecological system we're seeking to steward is so pertinent and so present in a system like the potlatch that realizes, look, even in a more circulatory system, there's going to be forms of accumulation. So we need to, even with pre-distribution, need to have some forms of redistribution as well, and to celebrate it, right? To actually raise it up. Imagine our cultures celebrated a culture of redistribution and saw that as a goal rather than wealth, status, etc., in the capitalist accumulative kind of sense.
So this idea of sharing, of collective wealth and of reciprocity seems to be a common theme of organizations and also just cultures moving forward into post-capitalism. How does this play out at the Post-Growth Institute in terms of what you've seen working in helping people imagine a different way that we can organize?
Yeah, there's two avenues that we feel open pathways to post-capitalist futures. The way we've been discussing is how we can move our money, move our labor, move our attention, etc., in the formal market economy. But there's also an important decommodification of the economy that's necessary. What does that mean? It means things that previously, whether it's childcare or things that we might be trading outside of the market, without putting profit margins on things, without naming a cost, etc. Just as, for example, 17% of Mali's economy happens through the gift. Things that are from childcare to education, where people are gifting in their labor, right? These sorts of practices are critical in terms of bringing back the relational in what is often a very uber transactional society. We have a process we developed 13 years ago called the offers and needs market, which is typically a 2-hour facilitated experience where people are sharing what they might like to offer and need from each other, whether they charge for it, they barter, gift, negotiate, etc. We see a few interesting things across cultures. First of all, cultures that have remained rooted in land and in family and connection find practices like this much more easy. But cultures where people have had less experience with this also find it easier when you start with what you're offering. So for the people listening here, what could you be offering your neighbors, your friends, your families that you maybe haven't thought of before? What passions do you have? Like you might want to go on dog walking with someone, or maybe you've got a sport that you want to connect around. What knowledge, skills, resources, and opportunities do you have? And where can you share that with others in ways that you might have previously thought, well, no, I only do my job. It's here. That's the limit of it. Because I live in Argentina on Mapuche lands. And what I noticed there is this is a place where the majority of people voted for the right-wing government at the moment. And there's a tendency in progressive spaces, I think, to mischaracterize people from other political persuasions, particularly in terms of their political ideologies and values, etc. Yet, in the US, for example, the strongest forms of cooperativism, in terms of actual utility, cooperativism, etc., exist in the red states, right?
How so?
Well, because you have in rural towns a history of people saying, let's band together to create this cooperative, whether it's a bank, whether it's the water system, the electricity, etc., because the federal government's not going to care about us and the corporations are not going to see a market here.
Let's take care of each other.
Right.
Oh, so you're saying empirically there's more cooperatives.
There's more cooperatives in
very
this, right? And especially in rural conservative areas. Now, in my small town that voted the way it did, I get there and within a few days, I get access to a WhatsApp group that is at maximum, 1,250 person maximum, and a spot opened up. And so I jump in, and it's the micro local economy WhatsApp thread, where on a daily basis, thousands of things, more than 1,000 things every day, get traded across this microeconomy with the 25,000 people that live in my town. The point here, and this is a segue perhaps into a conversation around collapse, this reciprocity, these meeting of offers and needs informally, and I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Dr. Caroline Shanaz Hossain on things like ROSCAs, rotating and savings credit associations, ways that people band together to pool money and resources. This is the lived reality of so many peoples that have been living through collapse for so long, and particularly in Black, indigenous communities and people of color more broadly, and rooted cultures. We see this cooperativism not just part of who they are, but also part of the survival tactics to get through the kinds of challenges. And when we hear this word of resilience, resilience is so often practical in nature, right? It's not only just a mentality, it's a banding together in order to make things work. And it also has deep cultural connections too. I think the last example I want to share here is I live in a country that has almost 50% poverty in terms of empirical measurement. And it's the country other than Libya that in the last 60 years has had more recessions than anywhere else in the world, right? So this is a country that has, by all empirical growth measurements, been failing.
Argentina.
And in Argentina, you see so much struggle, so much childhood poverty, so much hunger, so many people living without access to basic resources, water, food, electricity, etc. And yet, even in these struggles, and I can be driving through Vija, an area that is really impoverished, and even though the parents of a family might be working 3, 4, 5 jobs, 100 hours a week perhaps to survive, there will be times in the day where that family will pull out their chairs in the street, because that's the only space that they may have that has enough space, and they will sit and drink mate together. That deep-rooted understanding of connection, relationship, and family amidst struggle. We talked about the dysregulating effect that often happens in capitalism. Communities around the world have fought for and maintained regulating forces so that they can maintain their sanity, their connection, their relationship amidst the ship going down. That gives me a lot of hope that outside of the bubble of the US experience, the Australian experience, the European experiences that exists in Western Europe in particular, there are people who show us how to be while collapse continues to cascade, and how to actually thrive in some ways amidst that kind of challenge.
As you share these examples and you speak about collapse, which is maybe what we can end with, how do you understand the notion of collapse of capitalism, and what does that mean? And is it in some ways an opportunity, or is it something we should be worried about? Because I think when people hear collapse, they get worried and they think of anarchy and mass suffering. Maybe that's what will happen. Maybe that's what has to happen in order for us to get to the other side.
Yeah.
How do you wrap your head around the idea of collapse?
First of all, I think there's different forms of collapse we're talking about here. Often when people talk about collapse in these kind of conversations, we're talking about full systems collapse. And yes, they're often talking from a Western-centric, Eurocentric perspective of what does it look like for healthcare systems to collapse, for education, for financial systems to collapse, etc., in terms of lived experience. And this is where I would say most of the global north is terribly underprepared, right? I remember living through fires in the location where I was, and the basic service provision that was possible in the immediate aftermath was so underprepared that I went in with a group of 95 other people on bicycles because they didn't even have the ability to deal with the electricity lines being down and first responders. And so we're there going into homes where people with disability have been locked in with the inability to leave their homes amidst a fire, and there's not even awareness from people outside that there's people living in homes. I'm giving this very specific example to highlight that that's quite different often and hard for us to even realize that in parts of the world that have been living through genocide, been living through extractive forces that have meant impoverishment on incredible levels, there is greater awareness, versatility, and adaptation to these kinds of things. When the electricity goes out in Argentina, it's a very different experience to when the electricity goes out in the US, in my lived experience. In the US, everybody freaks out. In Argentina, everybody goes along their way. In fact, I'll give you a perfect example of this. You could imagine as a listener this experience happening and see what you think would happen in your lived experience. I was at a supermarket about 3 years ago in Argentina, and the power went out. And in that moment, I'm always listening for, the level of noise in a space. There was no increase in the decibels of people's conversation one bit. All I saw was in the darkness, this is in the night, it's pitch dark, and then all of a sudden, little lights come on from the phone, and people just continue searching their things, getting their things, go line up in the very long line in the pitch dark, and half an hour later, the lights come on and the systems come on and everybody pays. There wasn't a single increase in the level of noise. That fundamental difference in the preparedness gives me hope and also gives me despair. The hope is that people have journeyed through aspects of what we are facing, not on the scales that we're talking about, especially when you have centers like the US that have such an interconnectedness to other systems and bring other systems down. What we're facing is not pretty. And it's not going to be pretty in the places where people are underprepared for this. However, this is where we need to turn to, this idea of turning to BIPOC leadership, of turning to women and non-binary bodies to look for leadership is often given as tokenistic lip service. This is why we need to turn to people in those bodies amongst many other things, because they hold the wisdom for how to navigate through these kinds of challenges.
They actually know what we need to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They have the experience
right.
and the knowledge.
And they have the capacity to stay calm enough that they can work out what to do in circumstances that aren't familiar. Just like indigenous cultures in crisis would often have women assemble in some kind of structure and go into a meditation to feel into what should we do, and then someone would speak, and then they would tell the men what to go in action from that wisdom.
Just to tie together the conversation, because we touched on so much here, we spoke about ways to fix the monetary system, ways to shift towards not-for-profit businesses, and also this idea of potential impending collapse. Do you think that there's a way for us to thread the needle towards shifting towards not-for-profit businesses, shifting culture towards less extraction, more sharing, better forms of leadership, better forms of cooperation, and avoid a collapse?
It's a great question, and I'm going to answer it by way of a story. Many years ago, I was in Hungary speaking to an audience of about 30 people, mostly students in their mid-20s. And I was on a panel where someone asked this question of can we avoid collapse? The speaker before me, who was an engineer, said, absolutely, we can innovate our way out of this. It came to me and I said, I'm really glad that this question's been asked, because for me, there's no way we can avoid collapse in terms of full systems collapse now. We've gone well past the lock-ins that play here such that an unraveling is going to happen no matter what we do. And something fascinating happened as I said that, and I'd anticipated this, which is why I decided to say this in this particular space. I watched when I said there's no way to avoid collapse, the audience members' shoulders dropped in a good way.
They relaxed.
They relaxed. And I went up to them afterwards, some of them, and I said, what happened?
These are young people? Students?
These are students in their 20s. And I asked them, what is it that happened for you when I said that piece about collapse? And they said, almost universally, it was like you gave us the permission to feel what we were feeling in our bodies and to not deny the realities that we knew. And there was an ease associated with that. What I've found, having been someone who's accepted that mass-scale collapse is going to continue to cascade in a particular way, is that without, again, diminishing the devastating impacts of what that means, understanding that also offers a liberatory approach, because now I'm not trying to save capitalism, I'm not trying to save a system. I'm instead interested in committing to planting seeds for post-capitalist futures. I don't believe that humanity will be fully wiped out. I don't believe that. I do think that we're going to see collapse of global systems. And I'm interested in this notion again of 7 generations. I'm really interested in that. I'm interested in letting go of the idea that I need to be a savior in this world to come up with some kind of system that we can help evolve to. And instead, doing what I can to help create something that I will never likely get to see the fruition of which in my lifetime. Again, not from some heroic, oh, what a martyr, doing it. But actually, that's the kind of time scale that this is going to take. You can't turn around. You might look at Cuba and what happened in terms of surviving peak oil and go, oh, look how quickly we can transit. No, we are so interwoven in a group traumatic experience. And trauma takes time to unpack. It takes a lot of healing. We see this in post-apartheid spaces, etc. You don't just change things overnight because you change the operating system. This is an ongoing journey. The not-for-profit world I'm alluding to is just a step in the journey. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have a lot of healing work to do, and it's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of years. As technology continues to roll on in particular ways and all sorts of challenges emerge, it's the cult of speed that has disconnected us from all that is really important in terms of our bodies, the earth around us, and the understanding of what it means to live in harmony with life. To reconnect with that, we have to go through various cycles that take time. But what we can do is we can contribute in our own ways to the systems change. It's not changing a light bulb. This is about ways that you can help bridge the gap between money and debt and inequality by moving your money to a not-for-profit bank, by moving your labor, etc., these things, by slowing down where possible and seeking to make decisions from that more embodied state, and by connecting with each other as much as possible through a relational rather than transactional lens. These things inspire others. I've been inspired by people who do these things, and we and you and I can do that with each other. Even this conversational, which feels so relational, that's part of it. Planting seeds, giving people a sense of what that world beyond capitalism feels like, not just what it looks like.
Well, Donnie, this has been enlightening, and I feel relaxed now, even though we're talking about talking about collapse.
Right.
Because I think you've given people an idea of how to help plant seeds for a better future, how to hospice the current system, which is slowly dying, and also a pretty good diagnosis as to why.
Right.
So thank you for sharing your wisdom today.
Thank you. And thanks to all your listeners. It's wonderful to be here with you all.
Thanks, Donnie. To go deeper into Donnie's work, I've dropped links to the Post-Growth Institute in the episode description below, where you can find resources for exploring a just and livable world beyond capitalism. If you enjoyed this conversation, the best way to support the show is to subscribe, leave a rating, and share this episode with someone who's grappling with these big questions. After an episode like this, covering heavy topics like debt and collapse and the pathway towards a more sustainable future, I encourage you to take a breather, slow down, and get into your body. As Donnie reminds us, that's where imagining a better future actually begins. And as always, thank you for listening. Stay curious, stay hopeful, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.